don't say nothing, he just keeps rolling.
Welcome everyone to the Peekskill Museum. And I'd like to introduce the members of our board. Please raise your hand if you're nearby. Cal Schlick, our president. There we go. Bob Mayer, sitting out at the table. John Curran, somewhere around. Always hard to find, but Augie Augustowski. I'm not sure if John Beers is here, or George Oros.
Just pulled in.
Oh, okay, great. Ann Stein, one of our panelists. Karen Berghardt, I don't know if I saw her. And Rachel Kimber is outside. Okay, Karen's here. Okay, we're gonna just make room. You wanna come on in? We have a few more people just to make to the seats in the front.
Okay.
Yeah, you're on time. Okay, welcome. Paul Ganellis brought us a videotape we're going to see later. We all work hard to keep our local history alive, and we welcome new members. We look for interesting programs to share, like this one about the Robeson affair. And if you want to join, become a member, you'll be on our membership list, and you'll get our emails and our notes about the next upcoming events. Will be our holiday party, December 11th. Today, we are going to talk about Paul Robeson, and we're going to have a panelist discussion first, and then a Q&A with some discussion and sharing, and then we're going to show the VCR film of the first concert, followed by refreshments. So, we have our longtime member of the board, Augie Augustowski, is our first presenter, and he was there at one of the concerts. Augie?
Yes, I was there at the last concert. Why was I there? I was only 10 years old. Is this the microphone, Cal? Oh, talking to this? I got it. Thank you. Yeah, I was only 10 years old, and what would a 10-year-old kid be doing at a place like that? Well, it's a little bit of an interesting story. As you may know, or will find out if you read some of the literature here, Governor Dewey was rather concerned about what potentially could develop. He had committed a great number of state police to try to control what was looking to be a confrontation. He was also considering the possibility of having to call out the National Guard. Now, my father was an officer in the National Guard, and he and another officer were asked to go indiscreetly, not in uniform, to just observe what was going on and whether it was going to be over within an hour or so, or whether it was going to be an ongoing affair. So he decided he was going to visit, and he wanted to take me along. Now, you might imagine my mother was frantic. But he says, no, this is an educational thing, and it's a once-in-a-lifetime thing, so I think he'll be okay. And I'm here, so I made it through the ordeal. We arrived in our own private car, just the two officers and myself. We were stopped by some state police. My father explained what he was there for and so forth. So they escorted us into a parking area where they said that we wouldn't be involved with any of the altercations. And then they brought us out and introduced us to a couple of other officers who were, I'm guessing, were probably in charge of certain divisions and so forth. And we were allowed to observe and to talk to people. Most of the people weren't really in a talking mood. They were mainly in a screaming mood. What I observed, again, this is the impression of a 10-year-old, were a lot of very, very angry people, and also a lot of people who looked like they were having a hell of a good time. They mainly were the teenage boys. I'm not sure they even knew who Robeson was. They just heard there was going to be a riot, and they were encouraged by certain elements of the society. And they had read some articles in the Evening Star, which did not really advocate violence, but it did point out some facts that the communist movement was going to make an appearance in the Peekskill area, not in Peekskill, the town of Cortlandt, and that perhaps the veterans and some other citizens might try to express their side of the story. And we had a lot of veterans who had recently come through the war, and they weren't looking forward to a new war, but we knew that Russia was actively engaged in developing nuclear weapons. We knew of other things that were happening internationally. And these veterans really didn't want to go to war again, nor did they want their sons to go to war. So they thought they were doing their civic duty by preventing or interfering with these alleged communist entertainers and people who were arranging this concert. They weren't thinking anything about the First Amendment or the Constitution. They thought that they were out there doing a civic duty. And when you get that kind of a mentality, and it runs rampant, and it certainly did that day, now you get a bunch of young teenagers involved with baskets full of rocks, and it's amazing how these rocks appeared. They didn't just pick them up off of the road. They were brought into the site. So there was pre-planning involved with this, and I'm not sure by who or by whom. But what I observed, they had already, Robeson and the other members had already been escorted safely away from the scene. But there were still many, many hundreds, if not thousands, of men, women, and children who had come to see the concert. And they were kind of caught up in the middle of this, what I'll consider a unruly mess. There were men there that I'm told were Union men, not from this locality, but they kind of formed a circle and protected these folks to try to get them out of there, to get them back to the buses, back to the cars, get them away from what was looking like it was going to become a major altercation. And it did. Again, the details that I remember are some of the gruesome details. I guess that would be the objective of a 10-year-old. So a lot of people getting hit by rocks, because when you're throwing rocks at a crowd, you're going to hit somebody. And men, woman, child, or good guy or bad guy, they got hit and they were bleeding. A lot of people with head wounds. I saw cars, at least two cars that were turned over and windows smashed. And I saw busloads of people that were that came from Manhattan that were going to try to get back home, and they were being pelted by rocks terribly. All of the windows were broken. They were all laying on the floor screaming. I actually did not see too much actual physical contact between the rioters and the attendees. A lot of verbal abuse, mainly anti-communist and anti-Semitic. I don't recall of ever hearing any racial remarks being made. I remember in the crowd of Peekskill people in what we'll call the rioters, there were at least two black men who were probably veterans, and they were yelling and screaming at these alleged communists and so forth. It was an overwhelming experience, and it was, to me, a little bit terrifying seeing people, young children and young women being hit by rocks and being verbally abused. In one case, it was a carload of a family that was trying to get out, and a group of 10 or 12 young men were trying to rock the car and turn it over. It was one of the few times that I can remember seeing the police actually interfere with what was going on. They cleared the young men out of there. They opened the doors. They got the family out. I don't know what became of them. As soon as they closed the door, the young guys came back and turned the car over and smashed it. So there was very little interference on the side of the police. towards the rioters. If anything, I won't say that they were encouraging them, but I remember one of the officers telling the young men to, get on one side of the road because you're going to be throwing rocks at one another. So get on one side and it'd be better that way. So there was some arrests being made, and if you look at some of the photographs that we have around here and some of the news articles, you'll see some people being arrested. That was being done mainly if they were threatening to do physical harm personally to someone else. The rock throwers, they were on their own. They were just a mob. They would do their own thing. Mainly, the police officers that I saw were state police, and a few were probably county police. There were no Peekskill police there that I know of. But the crowd, we hear numbers of 2,000, 4,000, 10,000 people there. It was hard to tell because everybody was yelling and screaming and very, very loudly attacking the reputation of Mr. Robeson being a sympathizer for the communist cause. And that was something that was very dramatic to me because at that point I didn't really understand what communism was all about. I had heard about the Iron Curtain and some things like that in the news, but it was a very, very, I would say, enlightening and a very, very pivotal part of my life to see at that age a group of people who on one side were considered the good guys, but they were there to deny the rights of the bad guys, the rights of the First Amendment and so forth. They were there to express their displeasure with certain ethnic people that were there, and there was a lot of that. But coming away from it, and over these years, I've been amazed at how current it still is in the minds of a lot of people. Second-hand, third-hand generation, or whatever it is. I can only remember what I saw there as a 10-year-old, and I recognize that as being a very, very significant event. And I'm still amazed that there are so many people, like many of you folks here, who come out to learn what we hope will be all the sides, or many of the sides, because there are very many sides of people who are very opposed to different things, they have different ideas and so forth. We're not here to interject any opinions. We're just here to present some of these stories for you. You'll find it very interesting, and considering that you've heard a lot about these things in the past, we hope that it will perhaps help you either support your part or perhaps find that there is another view besides the one that you were taught or that you may have read about and so forth. So without further ado, and I think I've had enough ado for now, I will bid you adieu. I will be here and for the rest of the day, and if any of you after the program want to go for a tour or visit the rest of the museum, it's all going to be open. If this is an opportunity for you to see the Peekskill Museum for the first time, I encourage it. If you've been a Peekskill person for all of your life and never been here, I'll have some words for you too. And I may twist your arm to become a member because we need membership. This place doesn't just miraculously occur. It's been here for 70 years. We're not part of the city of Peekskill. We get no support financially from them or the state or anybody else. It's just guests like you and our loyal members that keep this place going. And if I may say so, I think we do a damn good job. Thank you.
That was great, and Augie is very devoted. We're going to save the questions for later.
I just need one point of information. He's talking about he was 10 years old at the time. I think it would be really helpful if you would tell us exactly the date
Sure.
that was.
1949. Yeah. Okay. Yes. It's right here. I'm about to tell you. I have it right in my notes. If you could wait a minute, I'll be right there. So we don't want to take sides or make judgments or have any political agenda. We want to preserve history. And let's learn history and about the life of Paul Robeson locally and internationally. will explore the facts and motivating factors surrounding two Robeson concerts in 1949. The atmosphere around that time, for years, there were actually some summer colonies that were the hotbeds of free-thinking individuals around the hills of Ossining, Croton, Peekskill. We've had speakers such as Dr. Thaler and Cornelia Cotton give programs on them. Robeson had given other concerts in the area, which had no violence. This was a benefit for the Harlem Civil Rights Congress, which was on the Justice Department's subversive list. Robeson was prevented by locals from performing the first concert on August 27, 1949, at Lakeland Acres. And concert organizers concerned about civil rights and rights of assembly held a second concert at the Hollowbrook on September 4th, 1949, just a week later. Accompanying the concert goers were 2,500 to 3,000 volunteers, mostly from the longshoremen and the fur and leather workers unions from the city. In addition to them, there were 650 newly deputized assistants to the sheriff's office and hundreds of state troopers. Days before, there were editorials in the Peekskill Evening Star newspaper that encouraged people to block the concert from happening, which they succeeded in the first one. But they're trying to block the second one also. So the veterans had a protest parade, which turned into rock throwing, car turning, and anti-communist riots. These riots were years in the making and had several causes, mixed with America's paranoia known as the Red Scare, and also with fear of blacks, Jews, and even New York City-style bohemians. The McCarthy era showed how the government had almost a pathological fear against Russia and communists. Robeson was just in Russia. Many feared he would become a black Stalin. He admired Russia's anti-discrimination attitudes. They treated him well, although he later found out they may have murdered some of his friends. So the blame was put on, of course, the left-wing sympathizers, mostly Jewish, were lumped by the FBI as communists trying to recruit. Governor Dewey and a Westchester County grand jury placed blame on the communists. The American Civil Liberties Union blamed local Peekskill right-wingers. The Peekskill paper was blamed for using insightful language in their editorials. The veterans may have had a lack of tolerance, but felt patriotic, and the rioters displayed immature and violent behavior. Paul Robeson was known for being an activist for world peace and for the Progressive Party. Through his music, he came to symbolize the fight for freedom. Now I'm going to introduce Ann Stein. Ann Stein is currently the treasurer of the Peekskill Museum. She grew up in California and is a relative newcomer to Peekskill. However, her connection to Paul Robeson and his Peekskill September 1949 concert has deep family roots, artistically and politically.
Thank you, Robin.
Good afternoon. Can everybody hear me? Yes. Paul Robeson's final Peekskill area concert on September 4th, 1949 was ordinary in one sense. It consisted of songs integrally associated with him. Go Down Moses, Song of the Warsaw Ghetto, and Old Man River. With respect to his art, Paul Robeson is remembered for his organ-like bass voice, a unique collection of songs, and a majestic oratorical gift. An early indication of Robeson's power as an artist comes from a story told by the famous attorney and atheist Clarence Darrow. After hearing Robeson read from the classic poem, God's Trombones, Darrow uttered the words of Agrippa to St. Paul, almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian. And later, while imprisoned for decades on Robben's Island off the coast of South Africa, Nelson Mandela drew inspiration listening to Robeson's recordings of Negro spirituals, songs created by people in slavery. Robeson found his unique art form in Negro spirituals. In the 1920s and early 30s, when hotels and concert halls, professions, unions, schools, and many other institutions were segregated in the South, but also the North, and most colored people around the world lived under colonial rule, tens of thousands of Americans, black and white, and Europeans were flocking to hear Robeson sing concerts, comprised entirely of Negro spirituals and Negro folk songs. Excuse me. When Robeson's concert terms, like no segregated halls and frequently tickets priced affordable for a pensioner or a minor, when these terms were not met, he usually managed to sing to his audiences anyway, in a church, someone's home or backyard, or a pickup truck, the back of a pickup truck. In the years following the Second World War, when his singing and speaking engagements encountered concert content restrictions, travel restrictions, and tour cancellations, he employed the same tenacity and tactical flexibility. He brought a very personal meaning to the phrase, "the show must go on." Robeson received critical acclaim almost everywhere and had many opportunities to comment on his choice of songs. In one interview, he said, "No one can hear these songs as our people sang them and not understand the Negro a little better. My own people, many of them, have felt that the old spirituals were not in keeping with the aspirations of the modern Negro. They feel that white audiences approach the spirituals in a patronizing spirit. Perhaps this is true, but it is what they take with them from a concert that means most. The distinctive gift the Negro has made to America has not been from the brilliantly successful colored men and women, but from the most humble of our people, that the music now recognized as of abiding beauty has emanated." In New York City and elsewhere, as Robeson achieved acclaim as a leader of his race, Robeson expanded on the theme of his people as a positive force in history. "There is no expression of hate or revenge in their music," he said. "That a race which has suffered and toiled, as the Negro had, did not express bitterness, but expressed love, is strong evidence of the influence of Christianity. These songs represent the soul of my people. White and colored people react alike to the songs. Differences are forgotten and prejudices vanish when mixed audiences meet at the concert. Humanity is helped and lifted to higher levels." Robeson preferred the word Negro to black. Negro conferred a sense of the historical, cultural, and racial bonds between all Africans, including African Americans. His enormous curiosity in other people's cultures and his ability to move among them opened up new audiences. It became common practice for him to learn a folk song or two in the native tongue of the countries in which he was preparing to tour. Years later, Pete Seeger said of him, "Robeson's idea of a good weekend was to learn a new language." A shared history of slavery between Negroes and ancient Hebrews forged his deep connection with Jewish people generally. He felt a similar kinship with Russians through their language, history, and literature. Both bonds would strengthen during the Second World War. During his young adulthood, Robeson showed no interest in politics, but calamitous world events in the second half of the 1930s caused him to broaden his conception of a true artist to include defender of humanity and its cultural achievements from fascism. Italy's invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 and his trip to the front lines of the Spanish Civil War in 1938 solidified his belief that fascism, racism, and imperialism could only be defeated by a coalition of like-minded people, irrespective of race or nationality. Robeson became one of the most identifiable figures in the anti-fascist movement, and for the next decade, his universal appeal reinforced and magnified his influence. During the war years, he was at the summit of his extraordinary influence on Americans' mainstream culture. When he sang Ballad for Americans on CBS radio in 1940, the volume of callers inquiring as to the identity of the singer caused the switchboards to collapse. Robeson became a household name, and his presence alone was a symbolic appeal for racial equality in America and around the world. By 1949, Robeson was in a rapid descent from this height of popular affection. In a span of 3 years, Robeson became the embodiment of everything un-American. Outside of major metropolitan areas where he still had a following, city halls and school districts had become battlegrounds over his right to sing, and in early 1949, a booked 85-concert tour across the United States collapsed. Agents were running for cover as the entire entertainment industry was under attack for subversive elements. All but one of the organizations with which Robeson was affiliated were labeled communist fronts by the U.S. Attorney General, and that exception was just an oversight. Peekskill, 1949. In the aftermath of the 1949 Peekskill area concerts, Robeson and most concert goers saw in the attackers a fascist mob. This is understandable. The attackers and their supporters on the sidelines shouted slogans and held signs: Hitler had it right, nigger lovers, go back to New York City, you can get in, but you won't get out. County law enforcement fraternized with the anti-Robeson groups more than they protected the concert goers. Of the 150 buses carrying concert goers from the New York City area, almost a third were damaged by stones that tore through the windows. Many buses were subject to multiple attacks as the drivers tried to recover from direct hits. Other hired drivers abandoned their buses on foot, leaving concert goers even more vulnerable. Over 150 concert goers were injured, 6 seriously. One man, Sid Marcus, was lucky to be alive. Robeson himself had a dangerous escape, an escape for which he would thank his Jewish friends to the end of his life. The September 4th concert also marked the end of Robeson's longtime collaboration with his musical arranger, primary song researcher, and piano accompanist Larry Brown, who had played the piano on that day in Peekskill area. Brown told Robeson that he just could not tolerate the threats of violence. No one was held to account for the violence and sheer physical terror. New York State's highest political leaders failed to condemn the violent acts. The congressman representing the Peekskill area gave a speech to the House entitled "The Communist Military Raid on Peekskill." Governor Dewey ordered a grand jury investigation, but made it clear that he expected the jury to find communism at the root of the violence. the grand jury did just that. It cleared veterans of all responsibility and said that unbalanced teenagers had committed the violence, but that communism was the sole underlying cause of that violence. Now, you don't have to be a Robeson supporter to view these assessments and legal proceedings with deep skepticism. Fortunately, in the decades that followed, we have a more believable and verifiable history of those days. We know that the men and a few women that committed the violence consisted of 3 groups: teenage and other young men, some veterans affiliated with the various local veterans groups that had organized lawful protests. The Peekskill Evening Star estimated that around 300 of the veterans were involved in the violence. And 3, a diverse group of local residents drawn into the rioting spontaneously from the sidelines. But why? My fellow panelist, John Curran, will identify some national and international events that probably amplified local residents' fears. I want to lay out some concrete local grievances that particularly affected the groups who committed the violence. In the years following World War II, Peekskill youth had been committing a highly disproportionate number of acts of violence, of vandalism, and other forms of juvenile delinquency. This was a focal point of residents' concerns at the time, and many progressive ideas to address the need for opportunities for recreation and work for the young men were presented to the Peekskill Common Council. All plans ultimately failed to even get off the ground. Similarly, promises year in and year out to homecoming World War II veterans for good housing and work faltered at both state and local levels. By 1949, some veteran group leaders, including several influential members of the American Legion, were blaming these failures on outsiders. They directed Peekskill's deep real-life frustrations toward communism and its supposed local embodiment in the Mohican colony summer residents, who were almost all Jewish. FBI memos clearly identify the organizers of the violence as vets, a strong suggestion as to the reason for the vets' protection from the law comes from one private intelligence gatherer, Carl Barslag. He had been hired by the American Legion in 1947 to head its new department, which was modeled on the House Un-American Activities Committee hierarchy itself. They set up their own subcommittee on subversive activities. And in the aftermath of the concert violence, Barslag was the New York State Grand Jury's primary source of information. Further undermining the validity of the grand jury's findings, the man who organized the jury's investigative hearings, Westchester County District Attorney George Fanelli, was the very same person responsible for Westchester County law enforcement the day of the concert. Now, the organizers of the violence hid behind political and law enforcement leaders who deflected their own failings by exploiting people's fear and bigotry. To my knowledge, neither the veteran organizers took responsibility for their actions, nor the political leaders for their inactions. Thanks for your attention.
Okay, our next speaker is Beth Woogen, who lives and works in Crampon and has worked with the Cortlandt Peekskill Anti-Racism Collaborative for the past 8 years.
Good afternoon. I do want to very briefly thank the Peekskill Museum and the board for supporting and developing this program, and for allowing my inclusion in it. I'm going to dovetail a little bit with what Anne has just said. We'll try to get through this as in a most timely way. I'm going to give a little more attention to Paul's political biography to expand some understanding of these aspects of his life. I found that trying to condense the scope of Paul Robeson's biography into a profile to be presented in 10 minutes, a task that bordered on the absurd. Yet this exercise is necessary to understand how his coming to entertain picnickers at 2 locations a couple of miles down the road from where we sit today became the focus of state-condoned mob violence on 2 nights in August and September of 1949. Robeson's collaboration with pianist and arranger Lawrence Brown brought the spiritual and secular music of Black America to prominence on the concert stage to audiences throughout the United States, Europe, Asia, and Africa. He extended his repertoire, including folk music, songs of workers' struggles, and anthems of national liberation of people from all over the world. He left the confines of the traditional concert hall to sing in music halls, cinemas, churches, union halls, and stadiums, to include the thousands of people who could never afford admission otherwise. He refused to appear in segregated venues and abandoned working as a film actor because he could find no roles that depicted African American people as whole human beings. He was a committed activist. He co-founded the Council on African Affairs, supporting the anti-colonial struggle towards national liberation in Africa, supported Republican Spain, was active in the Committee to Aid China and the Anti-Fascist Committee. He performed to the benefit of Jewish refugees, Basque refugees, and South African famine victims, among many others. He was an ardent ally of the movement to organize labor in the United States and internationally, supporting organizing efforts of the United Auto Workers, longshoremen and warehousemen, maritime workers, government workers, and many others. Always foremost in these alliances was the goal of ending racial discrimination in hiring as the linchpin of ending racial segregation through all aspects of our society. With the entry of the U.S. into the Second World War, he devoted his work to the war effort, often performing without a fee. Robeson's world travels had brought him to the Soviet Union during the 1930s. He was deeply impressed by learning that all school children in the Soviet Union were educated against racism. He observed that he felt great welcome and personal security in the U.S., more so than at times in the United States. At the end of the war, as the world realigned and began the work of repair, he joined with Albert Einstein, Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb, and others in urging the United States to share the secrets of the atomic bomb with the Soviet Union, predicting that that would be, quote, the greatest guarantee against another war, unquote. We arrive at post-war years, bringing a resurgence of the trade union organizing and new directions for anti-racism activities. This time also signaled the beginnings of the Cold War, the positioning of the Soviet Union as the global enemy, and the creation of un-Americanism. Robeson was part of a delegation that urged the Baseball League to remove the ban against Negroes playing in Major League Baseball. He co-chaired the Permanent Fair Employment Committee to end racial discrimination in hiring, picketed to protest racial segregation in American theater. He co-chaired with Dr. Albert Einstein a coalition of 50 organizations creating the American Crusade to End Lynching, which was continuing with a frequent occurrence almost monthly through the American South. They met with President Truman. During that meeting, Truman rejected the plea to push for legislation and enforcement of laws against lynching as being politically untenable, and quickly ended the meeting. This became the start of Robeson's becoming a political liability. Many former allies and admirers disavowed their relationships. Performance venues canceled access. Robeson, although not unaffected, was not deterred. After the first picnic in Cortlandt in August 27th was prevented and picnickers attacked, he announced, "I'm going to sing wherever the people want me to sing. My people and I won't be frightened by cross burnings in Peekskill or anywhere else." The second concert was held before between 15 and 20,000 people. We know the aftermath. The work of silencing his extraordinary voice continued on many fronts for the next 6 or so years. Most telling was in March of 1950 when NBC television banned him from appearing on Eleanor Roosevelt's program, declaring no good purpose would be served in having him speak on issues of Negro politics. Through a lifetime of outstanding achievement in academic scholarship, athletics, a graduate of the Columbia University Law School, study as a linguistics and musicology, and acting and singing, this youngest son of William Drew Robeson, who himself escaped from slavery, fought with the Union Army in the Civil War, and then served as a church pastor, Paul Robeson challenged the expressions of racism and other oppressions as it affected him and all other African Americans directly, and held central to his artistic and political presence the fight to end this and all other means of human degradation. Acknowledging the exceptional position he had attained, Robeson never held himself aloof from the African American community, which he always referred to as my people. In the 1960s, James Hicks, who had been the editor of the Amsterdam News, which was the largest African American journal in the country, admits that Robeson was saying what the Negroes as a group would not begin saying for another 5 years, not saying strongly for another decade. This much abridged profile also informs my position that Paul Robeson's legacy be restored to its deserved place in 20th century American history, and with, at the very least, the respect and honor that it is due.
Thank you. And we have our one last speaker. John Curran has been on the museum board for 30 years in various roles, including 3 years as director and 6 years as president. He served 18 years as Peekskill City historian, and he is the author of a half-dozen books about Peekskill, including a few that are available for purchase today.
Good afternoon, everyone. I have no personal experience with the events or any of the people involved in the events. So for me, this has been a research project, and I've been working on this for decades already, trying to understand, the whole context and the dynamic and what it was all about. And that's what I'm going to try to explain to you right now. Though recently I've been fortunate to read, mostly I'm a reader, so I read the material that's available, and there's quite a bit of written material, by the way, in the archives, especially in the field library. And we have some up here. It's on the top of the case. contemporary reports from ACLU and this organization and so on and so on. And there are a couple of books, and there are photographs in the folder there. And there's a biography by Martin Duberman. I recommend it to you. It's well researched, and it encompasses Mr. Robeson's entire life, and it's really worth looking at. But for me, I guess the most insightful of the material that I've seen was written by his son, Paul Robeson Jr. And the title of the book is The Undiscovered Paul Robeson, An Artist's Journey, 1898 to 1939. Mr. Robeson Jr. describes his father over and over again because he's sort of mystified by him himself. He's impressed by his father. He doesn't really quite understand him, so he tries to really explain him, I think, in the books several times in slightly different ways, but the values are all the same. He sees his father as a strong individual, that even in his own interaction as a son with his father is somewhat formal. Let me just go on with this, that furthermore, Paul Robeson Jr. sees his father, in his own words, as a free spirit. That Paul Robeson himself has said about himself that he felt that he was given a gift by God, and he wanted to share his talents with the rest of the world. That's basically it. And to do that, he stayed true to these values through his entire life. And what I'm going to try to explain right now is, how can someone who's such a strong individual and have all these good values and do all these good things wind up from being an international celebrity and hero and all these good things and representing all these good causes to being accused of, being an enemy, a subversive, a scoundrel, and all these things? That's what I'm going to try to understand, because I wanted to understand it for myself first. And the answer is very simple, really. I could give you the answer now, but I'm going to elaborate on it a little bit. Robeson stayed the same. He was what he was. He was a real American individual, which I truly admire, because I hope I'm one myself. But unfortunately, what happened in the context of the times changed around him. From the 30s, with all the discontent with the status quo in so many different ways. And then it changed through the 40 and the wartime years, and different alliances and different associations were made, and then came the post-war, and that's really where there was a momentum built up. Well, let me get into that. A little bit about Mr. Robeson himself. First of all, I was fortunate to attend the large exhibit at the New York Historical Society. It was there almost 10 years ago. Does anyone here go see it? It was every aspect of Mr. Robeson's life. It filled 3 large rooms. And most of it was quite interesting. And he was a man of many different talents, and he was in almost every country in the world. And so he had not just a national, but an international influence. Now, in terms of that exhibit, by the way, and what the archivists at the Historical Society did, whether it was intentional or not, I don't think it was. I think it was, in telling the whole story, the Peekskill event was actually a very small part. It was in a corner. They had some video running and a little bit of words on the wall there. But see, that wasn't his whole story. That was just a small part of it in terms of his life. But of course, in terms of, media, that's a different story. Almost everything that Paul Robeson touched turned to gold in a way. He was extremely successful at almost everything he did. Beginning at Rutgers, he was the captain of the football team. He was also an outstanding academic. All of that was in the exhibit. I believe he was the editor of the law school journal at Columbia, and then soon afterward he found he wasn't suited for the law, but he did like to perform, and he found himself in the movie business. Basically, he went to Hollywood, did several pictures out there, and that's where Old Man River, that signature song, developed within the context of the musical. But his real love was singing, and as the previous speakers mentioned, the so-called Negro spiritual, that was really his forte. That's what he loved to do, and that was the most convincing music that he projected. And people around the world understood it, because most of the people around the world are just common people. and especially in Russia, that he felt a sympathy for the Russian people because they immediately understood what he was talking about, singing about emotionally. He says that several times, that this whole thing of the Russian serf and the Russian peasant, talk about people that have suffered for centuries. You see, there's some correlation there. So he loved Russia so much, maybe he spent a little too much time there. It's one of the reasons he got a little into trouble. Okay, let's bring it up to date. Now, all these factors about Robeson are confirmed initially when he performs here in this area. For example, there's an article here that was in the newspaper, the former Peekskill Evening Star. 1946, Robeson is invited to sing at the Mohegan Colony. And the headline is, Robeson heard by 3,000 at Colony. And the first sentence is, an overflow crowd of some 3,000 people filled the Mohegan Colony. This was the biggest attendance they ever had out there. No problems, nobody's throwing anything, nobody's yelling anything. It was well received. Okay, 1947, another news article. There was a huge concert down where, Washington Street, the Welcher Avenue, and then you go all the way down Welcher, there's the McDonald's there. Well, there used to be a baseball stadium there, and that was later used for a concert in 1947. And the article then actually praises the concert, that this is what it says, quotation, that first, we have come to hear Paul Robeson and to pay respects to him not only as an artist, but as a great human being. And the reporter also said that the music was really quite impressive and everybody liked it. There was apparently, because it's within the Peekskill jurisdiction, there was a policeman on the scene, one policeman on the scene conducting traffic, and no problem. So what happened? 1949 comes along. And this type of publicity begins. Legion wraps Paul Robeson concert here. This is 1949. Condemns political views of singer for the benefit coming up. And here's a picture of Robeson here in the column. Furthermore, there's another article in the Evening Star, August 28th, 1949. The headline, Robeson concert here aids subversive unit. The sponsoring organizations, the People's Artists, and the Civil Rights Congress were apparently labeled by the New York State as being subversive groups. That's what the headline is saying. So now the association is made. The Robeson is going to sing, sponsored by these two groups, so maybe he's, one of them too. And there's an editorial in the Evening Star, the local newspaper at that time. And the wording is really very instructive. Listen to this. These are the words in the editorial. Time was when the honor would have been ours to have Paul Robeson sing nearby. But the editor changed their points of view. Now they suggest that the sponsoring organizations were, quote, dedicated not to the broader issues of civil liberties, but to the defense of individual communists in the Communist Party. Furthermore, the editorial states, the time for tolerant silence that signifies approval is running out. So that was a signal to the veterans groups, we better participate in this. They were being called upon to stand up against these subversives coming into our area. So obviously, as we've already heard, one thing led to another. The veterans did the parade on that road there, on Oregon Road. And the first scheduled concert at Lakeland Acres in late August didn't happen because it was scheduled for the late afternoon. And there was so much disorder that the organizers decided, they couldn't have it anyway because it was impassable. So that was canceled. And there was violence there as well. That's when the violence began. The concert organizers rallied in Harlem, and it was really a big event. And they really were trying to answer the question, what do we do now? So are we just going to take this? Are we going to go back? Are we going to assert our American rights, human rights, individual rights and to have a concert. And they decided to go ahead with it. And Mr. Robeson was very much for doing that, again, because that's what he believed in. His values were very simple, it's already been stated. He believed that he had succeeded to such a point that he was in a position to help what he had already called his my people, especially the people in the South, who at that time were really denied so many things that the other people as citizens had in this country. And also that he also advocated people having their own points of view. In other words, freedom of expression. And so it's obvious that they come up again, and on September 3rd or 4th, I don't really remember which, Robinson's the 4th, so it must be. And at that time, all heck breaks loose, because guess what? Now the sides are taken. You're saying now the concert goers are going to have the concert, and they do, by the way. And Anne mentioned some of the songs that are sung. Most of them are patriotic songs, by the way. The national anthem actually led the concert. It was Sylvia Kahn that sang that, and then there were a couple of others along the way. But unfortunately, at the same time, the veterans and those opposing having the concert and the values that they perceive to represent are also there and ready for action. And it's chaos. It's a true riot, civic riot. And so we've been dealing with that ever since. And so in trying to understand the difference, I understood it in terms of, well, first of all, my life experience, because as many of you here, I endured the so-called Cold War. I remember I was 3 years old. I remember watching TV. I remember watching these planes taking off. There they're going day and night. Where are they going? Well, they're going to Berlin. Apparently the Soviets had blocked the access to West Berlin. So it was the Berlin airlift. And then later things happened. They were on the TV, they were fighting the communists in Korea, right? It's 50, 51, and so on. But there were a lot of other things along the way. When you look at the dynamics of it, the Cold War was a diplomatic and military standoff essentially to prevent a real war. But at the same time, both sides were really going crazy with this stuff. I mean, nuclear especially. And it was dangerous like all the time. I remember this thing all the time growing up. Could happen at any time because there were nuclear submarines, there were nuclear bombers, there were nuclear missiles in silos, and there was a great that feeling existed there for about 5 decades until it ended around the early 1990s. On top of that, there was this paranoia within the country about subversion and communists. And the government was a big part of it, especially it began with the Truman administration. Actually, he passed several pieces of legislation, for example, that anybody in public employment had to take a loyalty oath. That was also in New York State, I believe. And there was the subversive investigation unit. This led, by the way, to the McCarthy stuff. Actually, he came a little bit later along the way. McCarthy was really a headline seeker, so he went after the Hollywood people because that's where the headlines were. And if you read into that, by the way, most of those people, they were the creative people. They were the free thinkers. And he was sort of, telling them not to do all those good things. So it was really quite a mess there for quite a while. Now, locally here, people did pay attention to a lot of this because I know there were a lot of veterans and they were very serious about all this stuff. The Navy, the Army, the Marines, the Air Force. We had 3,000 veterans here, by the way, from World War II. Now, you add their families into that, that's exponential. You have quite a large population that sort of feels certain ways about certain things. So that's the dynamic also. But I want to also the FBI had started a file on Robeson and so on and so on. And he was no friend of Hoover as well. Hoover there's certain individuals within the government that really sort of targeted him, this whole thing. So it added to this fear and the trepidation and the paranoia and so on. But what occurs to me overall is that this is really a phenomenon. This is part of our history that if I can find the right paper. I know what to say, but I already wrote it down, and I thought it was pretty good. Well, I don't know, maybe I didn't bring it up here. But, oh, that's right. The individual in American history sometimes is rewarded, and usually is. You know, you're there at the right time in the right place. Wow, look, a hero. Sometimes it doesn't go that way. Sometimes you can represent all the good things, but you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. So you turn into the villain. I think that's the story, and that's how I understand it, for the most part. And unfortunately, Robeson has so many admirable qualities, and unfortunately, he did suffer for this individuality and these values to a large extent. So that's about it. Yeah.
Thank you. First of all, it's great for me to be here with my wife and enjoy something that can be enjoyable in Peekskill. I got to live in Peekskill in 1933, and by 1939, 40, I was well known in the school systems and any social situations that were going on. I had a girlfriend who lived a block and a half from the field where the first concert was to be taken. We had gone to concerts by Robeson over the years at some of the colonies that surround Peekskill, and it was a regular activity, among other activities. Well, that evening we decided to walk down to the concert, her parents and the two of us. And as we approached the concert grounds, I heard a baby crying. I ran over to where it was, and they had a black man under a car at that time, and there were maybe 8 people who were trying to get at him with sticks. You know, he was under the car, he was wedged in near running boards, if some of them remember running boards. And I got in the middle of it because I recognized so many of the people who were trying to beat him up. They called me a white Jew and backed away a little. They stopped doing to the guy, and he got out from the car in another place. And some of the people who I knew were drunk. They were classmates. They were people I had known for years. Classmates, and they were after blood. They were really going to beat this guy up. That's about it. That's what the story I wanted to tell.
Thank you. Yeah.
I just wanted him to tell you all about 50 years later how they apologized.
If I may,
It's a very interesting.
50 years after the event, of the September event, they had a meeting. It was sponsored by the Robeson Foundation. I'm a charter member of that. And Robeson's son was there, and many people who were in the Robeson friendship group, and plus many who were not. And a guy came over to me that time. He said, I really want to apologize for my part in the activities back in 1949.
Wow.
Thank you.
That's great. Thank you.
Come, carry me home, sweet say nothing, he just keeps rolling, he keeps on.